on a serious note, let's clear some misconceptions, stereotypes, prejudices, and confirm a whole lot more. Because this is meant to be a conversation, but two Greek boys on a stage, it's going to be a competition who can interrupt each other the most. Because in our household, it was "Τελείωσες," so we can speak. Have you finished? So I can then get my word in. And that's how we were brought up. But I want to get something absolutely straight before we begin. If I hear one more person saying that the reason Greece is in the financial crisis it is today is because all Greeks are lazy cheats, I will lean forward and give them a damn good pedagogic slap across the face.
Yes.
And I start with this promise or threat for two very important reasons. The first one is historical. The Greeks in Greece, not the Greeks of the diaspora, the Greeks in Greece have always avoided paying tax. It's a test of democracy to make people feel that their collective support of the polis is in everybody's self-interest. So first of all, getting people to pay tax was a kind of democratic exercise. It's also a test of character. A test of character. If you see a loophole, then you must brag about it publicly, because it's a victory. And you don't want to keep them private, because only idiots do that. And also, under the Ottoman Empire, it was a test of religion. Because if you converted to Muslim, you didn't have to pay tax. And Greeks converted in large numbers. And they said, and what's the big deal? Just because this Allah guy or Yahweh thinks he's the one and only true God, wait till Zeus finds out. So in my view, Greeks were religious in the pantheistic sense. So one more new God, big deal. So let's be clear. In Greece, the crisis is real. Just like corruption is real in Greece, as is tax avoidance. But the issue today for the crisis is more to do with the financialization, the chaotic financialization of our society. And the more we moralize about lazy cheats, the less pressure we end up putting on the political elites and on ourselves to redraft the structures of governance, so that these governments and our governing processes are, in other words, closer to democracy. And the more we moralize about these things, the more we build a smokescreen that hides the stupidity and recklessness of the golden boy bankers and regulators. The other reason I begin with this promise or threat of a chastuki, a slap, is not just to clear the air, but an opportunity to delve deeper into this murky divide between pathos and logos, between passion and reason. And of course I'm here making acknowledgement to Christos' novel, but also to this now new infamous incident on Greek TV, where that bully boy from Chryssi Avgi, the Golden Dawn fascist party, rather vigorously and continuously and repeatedly slapped the foul-mouthed, chain-smoking communist woman. Stop laughing, because I know what you're thinking. Half of you are thinking, he's a pig. But privately, you're also saying, she had it coming. Of course, in moral terms, it's wrong to slap anyone. But if we think about these incidents purely in moral terms, what else do we let slip from the horizon? What else disappears from view? And with this question, I'm not asking an investigative question like a journalist would ask, which is, let's look at what really caused X person or Y person to slap this other person. Let's look at the chain of events, the little provocations, the things that preceded that slap. Or let's not look at it from a psychological perspective, which is, where is the fatal flaw in someone's character that really caused this overreaction? That's not what I'm here to ask Christo about. What I'm here to ask Christo about the slap is the more philosophical dimensions to slapping. Now, the Neoplatonist English mystic philosopher Alfred Whitehead once said, there are only 3 ways to make people do something that they don't want otherwise to do. First, you can use logic. Second, you can use art. And if all else fails, brute force. So in other words, we slap someone when we've exhausted or perhaps we're not very good at either logic or art. I like the crispness with which this philosopher lays out the options. But I'm neither a Platonist or Platonic nor a Neoplatonist, when it comes to slaps at least. And to be blunt, I can see the conceptual differences between logic and art and force, but also I can feel that one also exists in the other. I can feel the force of art. It hits you in the guts. And I can also appreciate the beauty of an elegant argument. So in this perspective, Christo, where do you stand on slapping now?
That's... where I'm sitting on slapping now is that the slap that I wanted to deliver with that book was to a culture in Australia that had literally made me sick, sick to the stomach. A middle-class culture that struck me as incredibly selfish and ungenerous. In fact, maybe that's the specific word I should use, ungenerous. And I thought I wanted to try and write about a book that explained, or not explained, that's the wrong word, a book that painted that culture, that represented that culture. And to do that, I also honestly had to put myself in the middle of it. To do that, honestly, I also had to put my Greekness in the middle of that book, because I didn't feel separate from the things that were disgusting me. I kind of saw in my own behaviour, I saw in the circles around me, I saw in the world around me. I've said it before, and it is the real slap for me in the book. The most difficult part of that book to write is actually a confrontation that happens with one of the Anglo characters, Rosie, who's the mother of the child who gets slapped, and an Aboriginal man who I think delivers the real slap in the book when he says, "You're no good. Your people, your world is no good. I don't want you to have anything to do with my family. I don't want to have anything to do in my life." That for me is the centre of the book. It's not the question of whether that I don't think, I don't believe in the brute force. I mean, I have for a long time battled with the politics of resistance and opposition, and I have. At the end, I can't commit, and I don't want to commit to the notion of violence being the answer. But I certainly thought and believed that I wanted to deliver a kind of slap to the world I was part of.
You were angry about complacency.
I was angry about complacency. I was also, and I think it's particularly for the audience that we are all part of tonight. We are, you and I, children of immigrants. We are created and right from within a certain experience of migration and a certain, I think, responsibility that comes from being a migrant's child. And for me, trying to work through what that means has made me want to commit to notions of what you define as cosmopolitanism, but multiculturalism and anti-racism that are central to me and really important. And where part of the moral disgust came is really simple, is the way we were treating refugees to this country. That's where...
Yeah, we'll get to that topic. But let's stay with this feeling of disgust. It comes from the gap between the promise and the reality. It comes from, in my mind, from the sense that we are the children of migrants, but we're the children of people with big dreams. And we are also witnesses, if not collaborators, in a whole generation who has not had big dreams, who has made themselves all too comfortable, perhaps, with the little rewards which have been passed down to us, or which we have achieved for ourselves.
It was really interesting, Nicola, when you were talking about, and I agree with you, I can't bear to hear anymore the description of the Greeks, being reduced to this lazy, venal culture. It's certainly not my experience of who the Greeks are. But I couldn't help but also think, as you were talking, I've become more and more... And I'm going to be very tentative here, because these are... I was going to say almost at the beginning, I'm at a point of my life with a lot of this that I'm not going to pretend that I've got clear formulations. I'm still trying to work through these. A kind of change in the way I'm perceiving and interpreting the world. But I also am a little bit offended, I am offended by how I think, even in our culture here, some real concerns about people's economic status, their social status, their dislocation from the world gets rubbed out. And they're whining, or they're whingers, or they're bogan, or they're not. They've got nothing to complain about. I actually think that more and more I'm becoming cautious of the kind of language we, as an intellectual class, are using to describe people who are experiencing, I think, real suffering in the world.
I agree. But do you think that slap, now moving back to Europe, that it was on the Greek TV, was a metaphor for a collapse of dialogue, not just in Greece, but also perhaps expressive of the predicament you described in your novel Dead Europe?
I was in Greece only a few months ago, in March, and the thing that really struck me, two things really struck me. One was the children now of my cousins, who are just finishing high school, who are just entering their youth, their young adulthood, and how despairing they really were. They literally thought, we are a generation without a future. And that is what has been delivered to them. And it was the first time in all my time that I've I visited Greece where I heard people going, "You are so lucky to be an Australian." And first time I heard that, for a Greek to say that to me was kind of a shock. What did I see when I was writing Dead Europe? I saw a real ugliness that was being hidden in Europe. I saw that you didn't have to go very far from the Disneyland centres of Paris, of London, of Prague, to see real misery and a real ugly consequence of a new economic order. But at the same time, and Dead Europe came out of this, was that you saw a complete collapse of progressive and, I guess, utopian ideas about what was possible in transforming people's lives. So that's when I talk about the bleakness of writing Dead Europe. That's where it came from.
You were spot on then. I think it's one of the most prescient novels of our times.
I wish I wasn't.
Well,
yes.
We've got no control over the destiny of other things, but you wrote it as a fantasy novel in a way, but it now reads as a documentary. And what is stunning about that novel is that it captures the collapse of the Enlightenment principles upon which Europe was founded. The collapse of the collective and rational structures of belief systems, and the failure of our current political elites in Europe and to a large extent here in Australia. We have people who would quite happily divide up Australia now in ways in which our founding fathers, who had the same Enlightenment vision, would be appalled by. The state's wishes to control their own wealth, you know, the word wealth creating, is one of the most appalling spins of our current vocabulary. And in Europe, its failure to create a political structure to an economic problem is again indicative of a collapse of a whole rhetoric of, and a whole, not just rhetoric, a whole ideology that can unify people. And so, in these slaps, what we immediately see is a slide, a regression. And it makes me wonder, if we are regressing, to what sort of state we are regressing to. Now, Aristotle distinguished between two kinds of life, between vios and zoe. Zoe was the animal function, our human need to procreate and to find nutrition, to eat and to reproduce. With language, we have vios. With language, we can start ordering society, managing our economy, defining moral principles, and seeking aesthetic pleasure. Now, clearly, at the moment, we wouldn't be saying, wow, vios is rampant. But are we heading back to a more animal state? I doubt that either. Because there's a sort of nobility to our animal status. And I don't even see that on our horizon.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, I'm going back to that moment, that incident you described, you know, that we all saw on television of the fascist delivering that slap. I think one of the dangers in the way in thinking through history is to think that it will be just the same repetition. I don't think what we're going to get is the 1930s and 1940s. We're going to get a relationship to that, but we're going to get something new, and that's what scares me. I don't know what will emerge from...
But you made a prediction in Dead Europe.
And
you predicted there would be a spectral...
I also have to say, sorry, Nick...
A zombie.
You asked me about... Yeah, well, you asked me about what... I was talking about being in Greece in March, and yes, there is that... You know, it's familial. It's that... relationship, because I have family there, I have people I know, I have friends there, and I see what they're going through. But the faces that I still remember now aren't the faces of the Greeks. They're the faces of the refugees and the migrants in the centre of Athens. And they are completely... They are zombies. That is exactly what you see in those faces. They're zombies because half the time they're out of it on drugs. They're zombies because they have no status. They have no work, they have no relationship to the very street they're in. That's all been stripped of it, away from them, and they are kind of in this no person's land.
Yep.
They want to get out of Greece because there's no future for them there.
But they can't go back.
And they can't go back.
And they can't go forward.
And I think the reason it's also important I'm going to draw a relationship when I was writing Dead Europe, is that's what happened when I travelled through Europe in the 90s, which is where the the late 90s, where really the germ of Dead Europe came from, is, and I think this goes back to my history as a migrant's child, was I didn't look at the Greeks, I didn't look at the French, I didn't look at the English, I was looking at the young Serbian guy who was cleaning my toilet in a hotel room in Cambridge. I was looking at the and talking to the Russian woman who was cleaning the toilet in the place I stayed in Santorini. I mean, that's, and I think for me it's part of my heritage that made me look that direction, but not only part of my heritage. I don't think that it's only that's the only thing that made me have that look. I think I'm fortunate to have a certain ethics and politics that guided me in that direction. But I think that ability to... I'm going to read something from Nikos's book, because it really... I mean, when we got together at the beginning to talk about doing this event, we were talking about multiculturalism and how that's almost become a dirty word. It's become a poisonous word. I think, as you say, post the September 11th attacks in New York, there's just been this kind of floodgate open where we talk about multiculturalism being a mistake or a negative. But I also have questions about multiculturalism, and I also have questions about cosmopolitanism. What kind of, and you say here, cosmopolitanism and multiculturalism are co-constitutive. One needs the other for each to come into being. Cosmopolitanism without multiculturalism is just an ivory tower. Multiculturalism without cosmopolitanism becomes a nasty ghetto. Putting them together gives politics a whole new agenda. And I think that I'm going to use the word, I was thrilled when I read that, because that's the relationship that I think is really important. Cosmopolitanism is not enough on its own, because it leads to, I think, a really elite practice and a discarding of real suffering. And I also think that I want to use the knowledge and experience and responsibilities that come with my background to look outside my background as well. I mean, that's how I interpreted what you were writing there. Do you think that's fair?
Absolutely, spot on. And look, we have certain privileges and responsibilities, and that is the wisdom of the people that we've seen in our lives, and the wisdom of people who are not formally educated, but who are actually very incisive and perceptive. And their wisdom is cosmopolitan, but their experience is categorised under the policy of multicultural. So my reaction against these two terms and the vigour with which I insisted that they needed to be seen together was to say that inside the policy of the multicultural is always an ideal that is bigger than the management of this so-called diversity. It's also a gesture about how you live in the world as a whole, rather than the particular claim you make for your specific community in this part of the city that you live in. And so my interest in the Greek community is not just as a Greek, but as a platform for being in the world. You know, in that sense, I'm as cosmopolitan as Socrates, who says I live outside of I live in the polis, but I live as a citizen of the world. But I am multicultural in the sense that I feel like I also start from a very specific position. But, you know, these are what gives us hope. But what we also, and this is what we're struggling, and I think, in a sense, to resuscitate, because I feel it's dissipating. And what you described of the refugees and the migrants and also some of the kids of Athens, thousands of them, tens of thousands, buzzed up with heroin, is a staggering image. And it's a staggering image in terms of the zombiopoesis, the zombification of our life now. And so it's an expression of the loss of hope, which is the opposite of the wisdom of the generation that came before us. And so, this festival, in some senses, has a profound opportunity to build connections before the chasm really gets between generations.
Yeah, look, listening to you talk about that, I think I'm going to make a personal aside in a way, but I think it has a relationship to what we're talking about. My relationship with something called the Greek community has been quite complicated, and it has its particular history now. And I think when I was younger, and it's a function of, I think, feeling like an outsider because of my sexuality in in the Greek community, and that's how I interpreted it when I was an adolescent and a young man. I needed to run away as fast as I could. I needed to run away from what I thought was an incredible patriarchal tradition that would not allow me to breathe. That's what you feel when you're an adolescent. That's how you experience it. I'm now a man in my middle age, and I have now a history, and part of that history is an incredible fortune to have been part of a family that has sustained me. And I think I didn't see it in my early 20s, but I see now that my parents, my mother, my father, their peers, their wisdom actually gave me some of the tools that I have now to create the worlds that I write about, to live in the world. And I think that at the same time, I actually think it's really critical to...
So Dina's actually wrong then, when she said that you haven't changed.
Well, of course. Of course I've changed, and one of that is, look, you look at the things you write, every one of us who is a writer, you can't go back to your last work without being blushing, The one thing that I am...
Do you ever read it again?
Not really. But the one character that I am really glad that I wrote was Manolius, the old man in the slap, because that's what I'm trying to say, that there is a language of responsibility and loyalty that and I think generosity that I got from that generation, and I wasn't aware of it at the time. I wasn't aware of how constitutive it was of who I am.
Well, you see dignity now, where before you saw repression. You see now the capacity to see the world in ways that are wider than you previously imagined. But maybe that person has also changed. Maybe that person wasn't as flexible and as inclusive as they are now, as they were then. And your first novel, Loaded, surely was a revelation in that sense of the tension that every adolescent who had aspirations to do the kinds of things you did, and as I did as well, it had this ecstatic resentment. You're ecstatic about wanting to reach out into all these new lights that the metropolis offered, and at the same time you wanted to be a loyal and decent family member, but you couldn't be confined to that domestic environment. So there's a constant tension between your desire to rush out into the world and also uphold and respect that which has given you so much nutrient. And so, in a sense, that was about identity wanting to break out of its own skin.
That's it's funny because when I was thinking about talking here tonight, just the last week, I was going back and reading stuff, and I feel like this was a really important book to me. It's called Days of Obligation by a Mexican-American writer called Richard Rodriguez. And he wrote, it's a book about he grew up in the United States, and his parents were Mexican immigrants to the States. And I used a quote from it in Loaded. And it was interesting going back to it, because when I wrote Loaded, the moments from the book that stayed with me were about him describing his desire as a young man to flee from the family, to just to get away. That's what I responded to. And then reading it again, I realised he wrote this as a middle-aged man, as both an apology but also as an explanation to his parents. But he says something that I think is really important. I'm not Dino, I'm not the young boy that wrote it, well, the young man who wrote Loaded. I thought that change has happened. But I also don't want to nullify or forget that that ecstasy of wanting to change is really important. I was thinking, one of the questions I have for us tonight is, when do we learn as middle-aged men to shut up? Because there are new... No,
we don't get the opportunity to talk about it.
But there are new for... There are... one of the things that interests me about coming here is across the generations, because there is... one of the changes that, for me, about these questions to do with what does it mean to be a writer of my heritage in this country is like I have nephews and nieces now who have very mixed parentage. Greek, Anglo-Saxon, Chinese. What is their relationship to something like multiculturalism? What?
Absolutely. I think that's the million-dollar question. Do we get to think through all these mixtures? Because on the one level, there's enormous spark and friction and thrusting energy that brings us together, like, black man, white woman, wow, hot. The Spike Lee films, right? Jungle Fever.
She's got to have it. Yeah, I love that.
And they want to have sex. They can't hold it back. No sooner do they do it, and they turn their backs on each other. And to one of my biggest disappointments in Spike Lee is the fact that he just let them sit with their backs to each other after that post-coital scene. And he didn't, for 5 minutes, let them try and work something new out, how they might actually find a way to be together.
You got to remember, Nicol, that Spike Lee was a young man when he made those films.
What would he do now?
What would he do now? That is the question. And again, we said earlier, and I think it would be a mistake to repeat that, somehow the intergenerational stuff is just a cycle.
No, I don't.
That's not what's going to, the 23-year-old will be the same 46-year-old that I am. I think, as I said, history doesn't repeat in that way, and I don't think culture and generations repeat in that way. But I was a youth in a time, and in a Western culture like Australia, where the politics were quite self-righteous and were quite ungenerous politics in some ways. They were also liberating, and they were also exciting, and they also were part of huge transformations. But I think my experience was that we could be quite cruel as young progressive thinkers, as young radicals. And I think that's something that I hope is changing in the way you talk about it in Cosmopolitanism and Culture. You talk a lot about the Greek is philoxenia, the generosity to a stranger without an expectation of anything in return. And I think that is a very... That's the way I want to think about my politics at the moment, and I would like to think about my relationship to writing and what I do in writing.
Well, let's go to that idea of hospitality, philoxenia, because the test of any principle is its capacity to be executed blind. If it can be extended universally to anyone and everyone. Now, philoxenia, as it was defined by Homer, was meant to be done blind. The host receives the guest without asking who or what you are. What? Because it could be a god in disguise, and Zeus was the god of hospitality. So your first action was to just give them food. After food was received, then you start talking. but the reception is done in silence. That's still the case in various institutions, Mount Athos, for instance. Now, if the principle has to be done blind, the principle means that justice is done before you ask the question, who are you, or what are you? Now, we in this country support a principle called mandatory detention. What sort of cannibalism, and I say the word cannibalism because remember, in Homer there's also Cyclops, he eats his guests, right? What sort of barbarian cannibalism is this new hospitality that we offer refugees?
We are the Cyclops. I think that is what is happening. I mean, I think it is I always wish I could I could say something optimistic to emerge from that, but I don't feel it. I think we are ugly. I think they're so starkly different novels. I think both Dead Europe and the Slap arise from that pessimism. One question I had, I read that section about cosmopolitanism and multiculturalism and how important that they must be aligned together. And that idea of the kindness to a stranger, for me as an artist, and I think you express a certain optimism about what art can do and what writing can do. And I'm not sure anymore that no, that's unfair. I do share that, but I have a huge question about it. And part of my wanting to be generous is then, how do we support the heretic, the blasphemer, the iconoclast in this as well? And to give it a context of what I'm talking about, say like a literary festival like tonight, how do we support the writers from our background who don't want anything to do with Greeks, or those labels, or those identifications? I think that's an important...
That's the test of our hospitality.
Exactly.
That's exactly the sign of a good family that says, and the black sheep is welcome. The door is not only for the good ones.
And I think that another...
And there were plenty in your family, I'm sure.
Black sheep?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Stop bragging.
No, I think that's really important. I think that's really important that, and concretely how we do that is to not ignore that history, is not to ignore those writers, to actually talk about them in our panels, to talk about them when we talk about the history of what is alternative, progressive, multicultural writing in this country. Because what happens is what we do then is efface those people. And that's what I
don't even think we've got that power. I think if we do that, they'll pump them up even more. I think the best thing we can do is work with the friction, because there is going to be friction and there's going to be tension, and it's how we deal with that and how we engage with that. That's in fact where the energy is. Yeah.
And the other thing I was thinking too, and I think, as I said, I've said right from the beginning, the excitement for me about this festival is about the beginning, the conversation, across writers. But I would like this to, in the future, I was thinking I want it to be open to writers from a whole range of backgrounds as well, because what our writing means, what our practice means, what our reading, what our is not confined to something called Greekness. It's true for us who've got mixtures, whose families are from different places. I think that friction, that conversation, that argument, that debate with writers from other cultures, with Aboriginal writers, is really, really important in what we do. Look,
Greeks were quite promiscuous, as you know. And as soon as you're successful and have got any Greek connection, we'll include you as a Greek. Patrick White is a Greek author. I said that in 1984, and in relationship to one of the first conferences about Greek Australian and the hyphen, how elastic is the hyphen between Greek and Australian. Yeah. I said, well, Patrick White is one of us. But on another heroic novel, I think The Jesus Man, if I can just come to that novel, which has not had much attention, but I think is incredibly deserving of attention because it focuses on a kind of energy that every young person in Australia feels and is really formative in their development, which is the experience of boredom. And it's a very profound experience of boredom. And people often mistake boredom for people who don't know what to do.
Yeah.
It's not about people who don't know what to do with themselves. It's people who have withdrawn, have pulled away from, who have refused to take the options that are in fact available before them. We've said to these kids, here, why don't you go out and play? No. Here, why don't you do this? No. What that's saying is it's not good enough. And out of that resistance and refusal comes a fantasy world. Potentially a fantasy world that produces images of an alternative world that may lead to a kind of politics even. But in the first instance, it produces a resistance to what is already here. And I think that was one of the bravest novels about the suburban landscape in Australia, because it is a huge part of our culture, and it's the part of that culture that we would sooner not talk about.
Oh, and we don't want to talk. We pretend we're not suburban.
We pretend, A, we're not suburban, and we never admit that we're bored.
Yeah.
I'm busy, but I'm never bored. Everyone's always busy being bored.
I think, in a way, The Jesus Man, as I said, every writer knows, you're just so conscious of where you failed, but The Jesus Man for me was an attempt to write, to write about the reality of the suburbs, which is where most of us live, where most of the world we inhabit. It also, you don't forget, or I shouldn't forget, the Jesus Man also, I started writing after the last recession we had in Australia, which was in the early 90s. And lots of my friends were unemployed for long periods. My partner was unemployed for a long period. And I wanted to express something of what becoming a zombie in an economic sense does to a person's sense of, what happens to them, how they disappear, and how that also the alternative that character creates in his head is a really ugly and dystopic one, and a mistaken one, but it comes completely from the economic situation he's in, and that's why the novel ends with his brother, and his brother can create a more, what's the word? His brother can survive in a way that, because
he can cope.
He can cope, and part of that is because he's been the favoured younger son, and because of fortune, and because he went to university. I mean, as I said, there's so much going on in that novel, and you want to go rip it back and start again. But I feel that was what I was trying to get to. So,
I agree. Maybe at this point, unless you want to make any further comments, or we can throw it open for questions from the floor.
Yeah, I mean, I think for both of us, questions are,
and Dina, do you want to come and be the lady who, with the mostess as the hostess, takes the questions and...
Hello, Chris. I remember reading in the introduction of one of your books that you said, I'm neither Greek nor Australian, I am the dash in between. And my question now is, do you still feel that way, and what did you mean?
There is part of me that still has a sense of living in that dash, certainly, and I think that I think there's also a faith that I have that there can be good work, there can be good writing, there can be good art, there can be good process that comes from that understanding. And I think it is important that I don't have to choose one or the other. I think the real change, Bud, is when I wrote that, I was a much younger man. I didn't have the experience. I hadn't travelled in the way, you know, that I have because of my fortune, you know. And so I have a very different... I still have this faith in that good work can come from that dash, but now I have a very different relationship to what's on either side of that dash. I have a different relationship to something called Greek, and a different relationship to something called Australian. I feel in writing Dead Europe, I kind of... That experience turned me away from looking at Europe and understanding my relationship, even as a Greek Australian in a European sense, and kind of and why I'm hesitating, because this process hasn't finished, I'm kind of turning in other directions. One of them was a return to the North Americans and to the South Americans, actually, kind of because I became really fascinated by the idea of the New World and the Old World, and what I won't be long-winded. I've got a whole way of... I'm trying to work out what I mean, how to understand that. But I think that relationship, as an Australian in this part of the world in Asia, is going to start more and more informing my writing. And I think that my writing has also been informed by a return back to... I mean, I was young, I've said this, but because it's really important, the books that hit me like this in the stomach were the Jewish American writers of the mid-20th century, who were the children and grandchildren of immigrants. And that's part of the return, and of the way now I'm trying to understand what my identity is. I also think the Americans are better at writing they write about suburbia. You know.
I think it's really great that Antipodes are having a writers' festival. For me, Antipodes has always been about Greek dancing and souvlaki and the Glendi. Christos, I was interested, you spoke about when you wrote Loaded that you felt like you needed to break away from culture, run away. Did you feel accepted as a writer when you first started out writing by the Greek community, which leads to my question, do you believe the Australian literary landscape represents Australian culture? If not, why not?
I think that I think it's taken me a long time to feel that I can say I am a writer without feeling like a fake. But I mean that quite seriously, and I think that is to do with certain conceptions of the artist and the writer that that have a currency in intellectual spheres, in the academy, in the publishing industry. I think that I think Loaded was published at a time when there was a greater possibility. I think a generation of publishers who were as... They wanted to publish stuff, they wanted to publish new work, they wanted to publish new kinds of writing. They were great readers of not necessarily the traditional Australian canon. There was a window opportunity where they became the heads of publishing houses, and they published some terrific work, I think. I'm a little bit dubious that I think that the literary world and I think the arts world in Australia has become incredibly conservative over the last 20 years. That mirrors the conservatism that has been happening in our culture generally. I mean, Coralie, I'm again very conscious that sounds pessimistic, but I think that they're not separate. I think one of the lies that we can tell ourselves as cultural practitioners is that we're somehow separate from the conservative changes in Australian society. But I think that's been reflected in the books that are being published, in the way the industry works, in the way the art world works, the way criticism works. So no, I don't think that Australian publishing is representing all of what I think is Australian writing.
Christos, I'd just like to tell you how I am in awe of all the awards and the success that your Greek name has brought to the Greek community. What I have a problem with is that when I've seen your films, tried to read through the slap, I've actually struggled with it. As an educator, is there a possibility that you're going to write a novel that we can put on the VCE, English, or even the Greek syllabus, that we could have a similar forum with students that would not be rated R? Because I think you've got some fascinating ideas, but I'm struggling with it on a personal level, and I happen to be doing this topic with my VCE Greek students. What is their Greek-Australian identity, with a question mark? And we're having a seminar on Monday. You're very welcome to visit.
Look, you know, I have been, I have said this for years, and it's really important. There is a particular English teacher I had in my middle years at high school, Mr. Javier, who introduced me to literature, and it was him and another guy, Mr. Cousins, who was my geography teacher, and he introduced me to politics, to a different kind of politics that I'd ever. And what they did was they made what I was reading as part of the syllabus exciting, but they also gave me books that were, Javier could see that I wanted to read challenging work, and he gave me books that would have been considered unsuitable for a 15-year-old, a 16-year-old. I think that's one of the directions that's one of the things teachers can do is point out paths, directions, places that young people can go. I would love it. I'd be really interested. I'd love a 15, 14-year-old to read Loaded.
Someone just said I did.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. So.
And you're still healthy and normal. There you go.
I'm not being. I know it's. I'm just saying that I don't think I will. I think the important thing is actually to come up, for writers to actually come into those classes and talk to. Actually, that's the really important work, rather than write specifically for what will be acceptable literature, because that's a very political question, and it's a very I don't know if a teacher would get in trouble these days if they gave you Jean Genet at 15.
Look, unfortunately, and I'm sure I speak for everyone, we could listen to these two talk and discuss and answer for hours on end. They're just so wonderful, both of them, both Christo and Nico. Could you please join me in thanking them very warmly?